Hi, welcome back to Beyond the Boundary Road. I'm Jadine Croft and I'm here with our language researcher, Des Crump. How are you, Des?
I'm not bad, thanks, Jadine.
That's good. So today we'll be exploring numeracy and the impact Aboriginal languages have had on English. So Des, we'll start off by telling us about the introduction of numbers into Aboriginal languages.
Well, for most of the traditional languages, they didn't have too much in the way of numbers or a counting system. Generally, it would only go up to 5, and then beyond 5, they tend to use many or lots of, and that was sort of, I guess, the only real need, because they didn't need to know if there was 27 or 38 kangaroos in that mob. All they needed to know was they needed 1 or 2 kangaroos to bring back to the camp. It wasn't until 1788 with the introduction of English and these new animals where they wanted to count things like sheep and cattle and horses and all of that they started getting the larger numbers. And so some languages actually adapted and brought in new language words for those bigger numbers.
Yeah, so how did the currency operate back then?
Well, with currency, it was more of I guess a trading rather than a money system like we know now. And so the trading tended to be things that were needed or traded. So, for example, the stone axes on the east side of Australia, most of them came from 2 places, Mount Warning or Lake Mundara up in Mount Isa, and they were traded all the way across this east side of Australia. So, and other places such as the dairy trading markets in Central Australia, people from Broome and the Kimberleys would bring their goods down to trade, as well as all the other parts of Australia. So every, say, 4 to 5 years, they would have the big dairy markets, and that would be a trading, centre for a week or even a month, where people would just trade and barter, and then once they got all the goods that they needed, they would then take the long trek back home.
Yeah. So Des, can you tell us about the recent revolution in First Nations numerical system?
Okay, well, as I mentioned, most of them only had the smaller counting system, and generally it was a system where I guess almost like a very basic base 2 system, where, for example, 1 might be Wangara, 2 would be Bullaroo. So for most of the southeast Queensland languages, they were the words used for 1 and 2, and then to get 3, it would be 2 plus 1. So they'd have Bullaroo Wangara, so 2 plus 1. And then for 4, it would be Bullaroo Bullaroo, so 2 plus 2. And then 5 was usually the same word as hand. So around the southeast here, most of the time it was either Ma or Mara.
Okay, so do remnants of those words still exist in nowadays?
I think so. There's still some place names actually have Bullaroo incorporated, particularly if it's a branch of a river, for example, where it breaks into 2. But and I think sometimes a lot of our families and communities, they still remember those counting numbers, and even now that forms a big part of the language learning in communities and classrooms, that being able to count up to, say, 10 in a particular language.
Yeah. So Des, have any new words come into fruition?
Yeah, well, Gamilaroi and Yuwalarai, for example, with the language program out at Walgett, they had to realise, well, we need the bigger numbers as well. So they've got a counting system developed all the way up to 1 million, so that they can use it in the classroom for maths and for learning.
Yeah. So have any of the First Nations languages left their imprint on English as loanwords?
Yep, there's certainly a few. Whilst I think I've mentioned how English has been invasive and taken over a lot of our languages, but it's also worked the other way. So we've had words like bandicoot, billabong, bilby. All of those sorts of words have been, as well as place names, have been used in English in everyday life now.
Yeah. So Des, are there any words that are commonly mistaken for being Aboriginal?
Oh, definitely. There's probably the most well-known one is didgeridoo, which is used all across Australia and particularly in mainstream life. But didgeridoo only came into existence in the early 1900s, so only 100 years ago, and it was based on the sound that the didgeridoo was making. So the anthropologists at the time heard this this droning instrument, this wood instrument, which traditionally was known as Yirrakai, and so he's heard didgeridoo, 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 so he's written that down as the word for that instrument.
Yeah. So, Des, what do you think, what kind of impact does the notion of having dual name places and locations have upon the community?
I think it's very important. Again, it reminds people of that Aboriginal presence, and particularly in the place names. There's a particular highway going from, or the Cunningham Highway from Warwick through to Gundawindi, where they've got all the place names and the signage up to say the Aboriginal meaning of that particular name, and I think that's important. It reminds people again about that Aboriginal place, that Aboriginal sense of space that was in that area. So I think it's part of that whole community awareness raising, and again that reconciliation, that understanding the Aboriginal history and the place names and that landscape before 1788.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us, are there any Gamilaroi words that are commonly used in English?
Well, one of them that's very well used is bilby.
Yeah.
That's from Gamilaroi. It's that bandicoot type animal, that little marsupial.
Yeah.
The other one is galah. That's one of our words as well. And then even our word for budgerigar is gidgerigar, and so budgerigar is sort of like, I guess, an anglicisation of that original word.
Yeah. That was really interesting. Thanks for that, Des.
Oh, thank you.
So that's all we have for today. Next week, we will be discussing the overall future sustainability of Aboriginal languages and recapping the main topics raised over the season. So stay tuned as Beyond the Boundary Road returns right after this break.